They never meant for you to hear this. Not in this lifetime, and certainly not in this world. The journal was supposed to burn, every page swallowed in fire before a single word escaped into daylight. But one survived. One man's private record, hidden in the attic of a crumbling Massachusetts farmhouse for over a century, sealed in wax and fear. And what it reveals? It isn't medicine. It's something much older, much darker. You've heard of the Salem trials, of hysteria, possession, madness cloaked in prayer. But what happened in the winter of 1847, not 15 miles from that cursed ground, makes those trials look like theatre? This wasn't a witch burning. This was a system collapse, a breakdown of everything the mind uses to define the real. Her name was Latoya, or at least that's what she called herself. No surname, no history, just a young woman found barefoot in the snow outside a Protestant farm, speaking in a language no scholar could identify, and never aging a day from the moment she was taken in, not biologically, not psychologically. She was brought to the Blessed Mercy Infirmary, a religious hospital caught in the crossfire between medicine and ministry, where her presence began to warp the environment. Clocks slowed, flames flickered in rooms without wind, rats vanished. Prayers echoed back with voices that weren't human. Nurses claimed she predicted their movements. Patients whispered that she entered their dreams. And one by one, the doctors began to leave, not for vacation, for good. But here's the truth that will stick in your chest like a nail. She didn't speak to people. She opened them, like books, like tombs. She made them remember things they never lived, regret they never earned, guilt from a different century. This isn't just a forgotten case. This is forbidden history. And once you hear what was recorded in that journal, you won. Could sleep the same again, but you clicked. You're still here. That means you're not like the others. You're the kind that hears the creak behind the door and walks through anyway. So let's begin. Because this wasn't a hospital. It was a gate. And Latoya, she wasn't the patient. She was the test. The Blessed Mercy Infirmary was built on theology disguised as science. Its brick walls stood tall not to keep illness out, but to keep belief in. Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore designed it with sacred geometry. 3 floors for the Trinity, 7 wards for the 7 virtues, 20 beds because 20 is the number of divine completion. Every inch of that building whispered scripture. But when Latoya crossed its threshold on January the 15th, 1847, those scriptures began to bleed. She arrived wrapped in silence. Her dress was torn, her feet bare, her skin cold, but not frostbitten. She should have been dying. But her pulse was steady. Her breath? Measured. Her eyes? Watching. Dr. Jonathan Aldrich, the hospital's lead physician, was a man of balance, faith in God, belief in science. Trained under the great alienist Dr. Samuel Woodward, Aldrich had a reputation for calm under pressure. But within hours of examining Latoya, that calm began to splinter. She answered every question, but only when asked. She blinked rarely. She never coughed, never sneezed. Her gaze would fix on objects no one else noticed, a crack in the ceiling, a shadow moving behind the curtain. When asked about her past, she would smile faintly and say, "I've been here longer than you think." The hospital's routine shifted. Minor things at first. Nurses reported dreams they couldn't explain. Dreams of humid forests, masks carved from bone, children chanting in tongues that left a bitter taste on waking. The chapel candles would extinguish themselves during evening prayers. Thermometers gave erratic readings. And worst of all, patients began to change. Mrs. Zelina Hitchcock, a pneumonia patient in Ward 3, claimed Latoya had told her secrets. Not in speech, but in dreams. Things she'd buried with her husband. Exact words from 20 years ago. The scent of his hair. The bruises she never admitted. 2. She awoke sobbing, thanking Latoya. But Latoya had never left her bed. Dr. Aldrich dismissed it as hysteria. Until it happened again. And again. Always with new details. Always from patients who never spoke to one another. Then came the first true fracture. A young man in Ward 1, recovering from a leg injury, claimed Latoya's whispers pulled him into visions. Of ancient rituals, drums beating beneath stars, blood mixing with fire. He said he saw his other life. And when he awoke, he wept like a man who had remembered a sin he never committed. Something was awakening in that hospital. Not disease, not delusion. Memory. But not their memory. Memory that lived in the walls, in the blood. And Latoya was the key. There are two kinds of silence in this world. The silence of peace and the silence before a scream. By her third night in the Blessed Mercy Infirmary, Latoya was wrapped in the second kind. You could feel it in the halls. The nuns spoke in hushed voices. The furnace flames sputtered at odd hours. Even the rats, which once scurried through the kitchen walls at night, were gone, vanished, as if the building itself held its breath. It was Sister Mary Catherine who first admitted it aloud. "She knows what I'm about to say before I say it," she confessed. "And not just me, everyone. She doesn't read people. She remembers them." Dr. Aldrich, ever the rationalist, pushed for more testing. He reviewed her vitals every 6 hours. He consulted Harvard's most obscure texts on neuropsychology. He even brought in Dr. Marcus Brennan, a linguistic prodigy, to decipher the strange tongue Latoya whispered in her sleep. But Dr. Brennan didn't translate anything. He trembled. "It's not Latin," he said, voice tight with fear. "It's not even a full language. It's fragments. Parts of Caribbean Creole, African tonal roots, bits of old Portuguese, ritual sounds." "Ritual sounds?" Aldrich asked. "Not for communication," Brennan replied. "For summoning." The staff laughed nervously at first, but the laughter stopped when patterns emerged. Latoya would speak, and lights would flicker. She would hum, and glass would sweat in the winter cold. She would close her eyes, and entire rooms would grow silent. Once she sang a single note. Just one. A pitch so low and ancient it didn't even sound human. The old priest, Reverend Whitmore, was in the building that day. He dropped his Bible, walked out of the chapel without a word, and vomited in the snow. From that point forward, the spiritual authorities demanded constant oversight. Ministers from surrounding parishes were brought in to observe what they called an unfolding heresy. But they weren't witnesses. They were subjects, because what happened next wasn't something they could cast out. Latoya didn't act like she was possessed. She acted like she remembered being worshipped. One patient began drawing spirals across his walls using soup. Another scribbled a symbol into the dirt with her fingernail until it bled, a symbol Dr. Brennan later identified from a banned Haitian manuscript catalogued in 1799, but never published. This wasn't demonic. It wasn't Christian. It was older than both. And it had returned, wearing the face of a young woman with no last name. February 1st, 1847. The hospital began what they called the observation protocol. 3 ministers, 1 doctor, all watching a girl who never aged, never asked questions, never raised her voice, and yet shifted the reality around her like wind through smoke. But what they observed wasn't behavior. It was distortion. Latoya didn't act within the rules of reality. She bent them, slowly, casually, like she was testing how far she could go before anyone screamed. A patient would ask for morphine and suddenly forget they were in pain. A nurse would walk into her room to change linens and come out weeping about her mother's death, a mother she hadn't seen in 20 years. Entire journals written by Dr. Aldrich started showing notes he swore he hadn't written. References to rituals, to rhythms, to songs under the salt water. Pages dated in his own handwriting, but filled with memories he did not recognize. They thought it was madness. But madness doesn't synchronize across multiple minds. Madness doesn't infect time. One night, Sister Mary Catherine caught a glimpse of something, just for a second. She passed Latoya's room, and there, reflected in the mirror, wasn't the girl. It was a woman, 40, maybe 50, same brass locket, same posture, but older, much older. The nun gasped, and in that instant Latoya turned toward her, smiling, as if to say, "Yes, you saw it." Later that week, Dr. Brennan uncovered something no one could explain. A ship manifest from a wrecked slave vessel, the Esperanza, dated 1823, 24 years before Latoya's admittance. Among the names listed, a 4-year-old girl. Name, Latoya. No last name. Languages, unknown. Survived the wreck. Disappeared 3 years later. Dr. Brennan cross-referenced descriptions. Height, eyes, skin tone, the same brass locket. Impossible. Yet there she was, still 20-something, no age progress. Essien, no records in between, just a hole in time where a little girl vanished, and now sat speaking in ancient tongues to Protestant doctors. When confronted, Latoya finally broke her silence. "I don't age like you," she whispered to Aldrich. "Time doesn't hold me the way it holds you." He asked her what that meant. She smiled again, wider this time. "You ask questions like this is your world. But I was here before you ever learned how to name things." And in that moment, Dr. Aldrich, a man of science, of method, felt something snap inside him. Not fear. Recognition. As if somewhere, deep in his blood, he already knew her. There are secrets that institutions guard more fiercely than gold, not because they're valuable, but because they threaten everything. Power, control, identity. And at Blessed Mercy Infirmary, that threat had a name. Latoya. After the revelation surrounding the Esperanza, the hospital staff split in two. On one side stood the men of medicine and ministry, clinging to doctrine and diagnosis like lifeboats. On the other stood silence. And that silence had a gravity, pulling people into it. Dr. Aldrich tried to maintain order. More notes, more observations, but his hands shook, his handwriting changed. He wrote passages in languages he couldn't read, fluidly, without thought, as if channeling someone else. And Sister Mary Catherine began to dream in reverse. She wrote it down in her prayer journal. "I saw my own death before I saw my birth. A woman in white, not me but through me, speaking to strangers in a language the trees understood. And behind her, Latoya, older than the earth, younger than the moon. It wasn't just memory. It was ancestral memory. Traumas carried across bloodlines. Visions that didn't belong to her, but were her. This is what no institution can withstand. The collapse of linear identity. When a person realizes their suffering might be older than their name, older than their family tree, older than their religion. And Latoya was triggering it in everyone around her. One of the ministers, Reverend Marsh, broke during morning chapel. He stood up mid-sermon, hands shaking, and whispered, "She knows the true name of God, and it's not the one we were taught." He was escorted out of the hospital by 2 deacons that afternoon, never to return. His Bible was found in the chapel pew. Pages torn out, every mention of Jesus scratched over with the word she. Then it got worse. One of the patients, a mute since birth, began singing, in the hallway, a low dirge, in that same unplaceable dialect. When questioned, he said only, "The sea told me. She's under the sea. She waits in the ruins." He had never spoken a word before. How do you label that? You don't. You suppress it. The hospital board issued a memo. The Latoya case is not to be discussed outside official channels. No spiritual speculation, no theological framing, keep it clinical. But they were too late, because she wasn't operating within their systems. She was rewriting them, and the cost of hearing her was identity. There's a lie buried inside every institution that the building is neutral, but buildings are never neutral. They absorb what they see, what they hold, what they bury. And Blessed Mercy Infirmary? It was soaked in secrets. In the days following Reverend Marsh's breakdown, something changed in the architecture. Not visibly, not in blueprints, but in experience. Nurses reported getting lost in corridors they had walked for years. Doors opened into different rooms than they had the day before. One orderly insisted that Ward 2 had shifted 5 feet north overnight. Dr. Aldrich dismissed it as psychological drift, until he got lost too. He took a wrong turn down a familiar hallway and ended up in a part of the infirmary that didn't exist. A room with no windows, stone walls, dust as thick as grief. And there in the center, a small iron ring set into the floor. No medical equipment, no bed, just the ring and a faint smell of seawater. He blinked, and the room was gone. Hallway again. Normal. Too normal. He didn't report it, not because he didn't believe what he saw, but because part of him remembered it. Later that week, Dr. Brennan made a discovery even more unsettling. Beneath the hospital chapel, buried under 4 feet of stone, was a sealed sub-basement. Not listed in any plans, not mentioned in founding documents, accessed only by a trapdoor bolted shut with nails blackened from time. Aldrich demanded it be opened. Inside they found shackles, dozens, bolted to the walls, carved symbols in the floor, not Christian, not even remotely European. And in the far corner, an altar made of coral stone, wet to the touch, as if freshly pulled from the ocean. Latoya was never told. But that night, she whispered to Sister Mary Catherine, "You found the place where they first tried to bind me." That's when it clicked. This wasn't the first time. This hospital had been built on top of a ritual site, a site where something, or someone, had been restrained. And they had failed. Because now she was walking their halls, breathing their air, touching their minds. The building wasn't just haunted. It was a prison. And she wasn't the ghost. She was the escaped prisoner. Not everyone was affected the same way, and that was the most terrifying part. Because Latoya didn't act like a force of chaos. She didn't rage or lash out or speak of vengeance. She chose, quietly, deliberately, patient by patient, one staff member at a time. Those she touched began to shift, not just emotionally, fundamentally. A nurse named Evelyn, reserved, quiet, devout, began humming lullabies in a dialect no one could place. She said it helped calm the patients. But when Dr. Aldrich listened closely, he recognized the melody from a dream he'd had as a child. A dream he'd never told anyone about. A jungle. A moonless sky. Firelight. And a voice singing that very song. He questioned her. "Where did you learn it?" She just smiled and said, "I remembered it when she touched my hand." Touched. That word kept repeating, over and over. She touched my hand. She looked at me. She said my true name. And every time she did, the person changed. Their posture, their energy, the way they spoke. Not possessed, not hypnotized, but restructured. Mrs. Hitchcock, the pneumonia patient who had requested to be moved near Latoya, began describing memories from before her birth. Not metaphorically, literally. She would speak of a life spent on an island, of ceremonies under eclipsed skies, of storms conjured with drums and breath. And she spoke in a man's voice. Her own voice, gone. This wasn't madness. It was integration. Latoya was reactivating identities, ancient pieces of people, lives that had been locked away by religion, by empire, by medicine. And the hospital? It began to fracture around it. Because what do you do when your patients are awakening into people who no longer fit inside the society they were born into? You can't diagnose that. You can't pray that away. You can only choose to suppress it or surrender to it. That's we. And Aldrich and Brennan made a decision that would change everything. They brought Latoya into the chapel, sat her before the altar, and asked, not as doctors, but as men, "What are you?" Her answer? "I am what was left behind when your ancestors tried to become gods." After the chapel incident, the Blessed Mercy Infirmary was no longer a hospital. It was a shrine, not one of worship, but of containment. The staff stopped referring to Latoya as a patient. They started saying things like, the center, the witness, or simply, her. Conversations became rituals. Rounds became pilgrimages. Even the most devout ministers, men who once thundered fire and brimstone from pulpits, now whispered prayers with trembling hands, not to God, but to whatever Latoya represented. Because by then, they understood, she wasn't sick. She was remembering. And everyone who came near her began remembering too. Not thoughts, not hallucinations, blood memory, epigenetic echoes, soul fragments breaking the surface after generations of suppression. One nurse collapsed mid-shift. She woke up an hour later speaking Yoruba, a language her family hadn't spoken in 3 centuries. She had never left Massachusetts, never traveled, and yet she knew names of rivers in Benin, rituals lost to the Atlantic, and lullabies her ancestors sang in chains. Dr. Brennan called it ancestral resurfacing, but Dr. Aldrich finally named it what it was: reversal, the great inversion. Everything the Western world had built, science, medicine, theology, depended on one lie, that the past was over. But Latoya was the past, animated, awake, and she had come not to tell stories, but to trigger transformation. And here's where you need to listen closely, because this part isn't just about 1847. It's about you, right now. As you hear this, you're part of a system that rewards forgetting, that praises obedience, that tells you mastery is found in controlling others, not knowing yourself. But Latoya was sent to rip that veil open, to make you remember the truths buried in your DNA, to awaken the hidden self that institutions, ideologies, and industries have spent seeker centuries suppressing. So if you felt it, that strange pull, that tingling behind your eyes, that cold breath at the base of your spine while hearing this story, don't ignore it. It's not fear. It's recognition. And now I want you to prove that you see it, to show that you're not like the others. Go to the comments and write this phrase twice. I remember what they buried. I remember what they buried. Let it be your symbol, your key, your signal that the spell didn't break you. It woke you up. Because from this point on, there's no going back. The hospital tried to keep it quiet, but something had already escaped. Latoya no longer needed to speak to influence people. Her presence alone, a glance, a breath, a shadow, began rearranging the minds of those around her, and not just staff, The town began to change. Millbrook, Massachusetts, a place of Puritan rigidity where every sermon echoed the sins of Eve and the redemption of Christ, began to murmur a new name in the pews, not Jesus, not Mary, but the Sea Mother. Children drew spirals in dirt roads. A local blacksmith refused to shoe horses unless they faced east. Farmers began leaving milk at their barn doors, whispering thanks to the girl in the locket. And on February the 11th, the river near the town, the Mary River, rose by 2 feet without rain. Fishermen said they saw shapes beneath the surface. Not fish. Not logs. Eyes. Dr. Aldrich documented it all. His final journals, now redacted by the State Medical Board, describe ripples in causality. He theorized that Latoya was not only awakening genetic memory, but warping the historical field. Past and present were beginning to fold. In one terrifying instance, a patient named Clara Howell, age 23, recovering from a miscarriage, suddenly screamed during her bath. Nurses found her speaking in a forgotten dialect from 15th century Dahomey. She cried for her sister, her real sister, a woman named Nkuba, who died in a Portuguese raid in 1492. Clara had no history of mental illness, but when Dr. Brennan brought her a 16th century map of West Africa, she pointed directly to a coastal village long erased by colonial fire. "She's there," Clara whispered. "She's still singing." That map is now missing, taken from the archives the night before Brennan disappeared. Because this is where it got dangerous. Men of the cloth, men of science, men of power. They saw what was happening. Latoya wasn't just a curiosity. She was a threat to history itself. Because if people began remembering who they truly were before borders, before Bibles, before flags and chains and laws, they might stop obeying, and they couldn't have that. So they decided she had to be silenced. But what no one understood was this: you cannot silence a tide. You can only drown in it, or let it pull you back to the source. February 13th, 1847. The Blessed Mercy Infirmary locked its doors to the public. The official reason? Contamination protocol. The truth? They were preparing an exorcism. 3 ministers, 2 physicians, 1 state-appointed observer. They gathered in the chapel with holy water, iron crosses, and copies of the King James Bible. Their objective: break Latoya's influence, restore order. But there was no order left to restore. The air inside the hospital had changed. Thick, salt-heavy, like the sea itself had crept into the walls. Electrical currents, though no electricity existed in the building, buzzed through metal objects. Glass shattered for no reason. Clocks stopped. Dogs howled from miles away. And Latoya? She waited. They brought her to the chapel at dawn, bound her wrists, surrounded her in a ring of salt and ash. Reverend Blackwood began the invocation. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." Latoya opened her eyes, and every candle in the room extinguished. They tried again. Read louder, poured holy water on her skin. It hissed like oil on fire. But she did not scream. She laughed. A sound so ancient it made Aldrich drop his book. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. It was knowing. As if she had seen this before, 1,000 times, in temples burned by empire, in women drowned for dreaming, in children silenced for remembering. She whispered a single word. None of the witnesses could agree on what it was, but every one of them heard it inside their minds. That word became images, not thoughts, not memories, visions. A white colonial church sinking beneath black waves. Children with silver eyes staring from behind masks of bone. A woman crowned in coral, walking barefoot across fire. And then the storm hit. Out of nowhere, a blast of thunder. The windows of the chapel shattered inward. Rain, rain, inside toe. He room. Tides where there should have been pews. Wind like breath from something enormous. The state observer suffered a seizure. The junior minister collapsed in convulsions. And Dr. Brennan, the most rational of them all, began to pray. Not in English, not in Latin. In the language of the Esperanza. Latoya stood. No ropes. No salt circle. Just a locket in her hand. And she whispered, "You cannot bind the sea with Scripture." After the storm in the chapel, the Blessed Mercy Infirmary never reopened. Official reports claimed structural damage, internal collapse, water infiltration. But no one could explain how the floors warped as if waves had passed through them, or why the stone altar wept salt water for 3 straight days. Dr. Aldrich vanished that night. So did 2 nurses. And the rest, those who stayed, would never be the same. But the worst part? It didn't end there. Within 3 days, other things started happening. In the nearby town of Peabody, an entire congregation fell silent during Sunday Mass. Not a single voice answered the minister's prayer. When he asked why, several parishioners said they didn't remember the words. Others said they heard a different voice in their heads, humming beneath the Scripture, a voice they trusted more. In Salem, schoolchildren stopped reciting the Lord's Prayer. Instead, they began drawing symbols in their notebooks. Spirals, waves, crescent moons with eyes. One teacher reported a girl in the front row chanting something she called a memory of the ocean before the land. She'd never seen the sea. She was 7 years old. The clergy blamed witchcraft. The press remained silent. But underground, word spread. A group of scholars from Harvard began quietly exchanging letters about a Latoya pattern. People awakening to ancestral dreams. Old traumas resurfacing with impossible accuracy. A fisherman in Gloucester woke speaking fluent Wolof. A midwife in Andover began prescribing herbs used in pre-colonial Caribbean healing. A boy in Ipswich named his imaginary friend Yemaya, a name he could never have heard. They weren't learning. They were remembering. Latoya had unlocked something deeper than trauma. She had reopened the human archive. And once open, it couldn't be shut. That's when the suppression began. Files vanished. The newspapers were seized. The state issued quiet gag orders under the guise of protecting public health. Blessed Mercy was demolished within weeks, burned first, then leveled. They said it was to prevent mold. But the ground where it stood still refuses to grow grass. To this day, because the earth remembers too. And now, you do. The only record that survived beyond the fire was a leather-bound journal, burned at the edges, hidden in the hollow of a chapel statue, recovered decades later during renovations to a nearby convent. It belonged to Sister Mary Catherine. Her final entries begin calmly. February 17th, 1847. The infirmary is lost, but Latoya remains calm. There is no panic in her, only gravity. She is becoming what she was. And then, the tone shifts, because Sister Mary Catherine begins to doubt God, not out of rebellion, but out of recognition. She writes, "What if we were wrong? What if the oldest holiness is not above, but beneath?" She confesses that Latoya spoke to her daily in whispers, not to persuade, but to remind. "Not a seduction, not a possession," she wrote, "more like someone returning a name you'd forgotten you ever had." Then the dreams began. She describes waking drenched in seawater, hands covered in sand, a full moon shining where there should be roof beams, the smell of incense she had never known, but recognized. In one dream, she stands at the edge of a black ocean. Latoya stands beside her, hand on her shoulder. And hundreds, thousands of women stand in a semicircle around them, eyes closed, humming the same impossible song. She writes, "They are not witches, they are not saints, they are keepers, and I am one of them." That's when Sister Mary Catherine makes her final decision. She removes her habit and writes, "The Church has lied. The devil was not a man, and hell was not below. It was inside the forgetting. I will not forget again." On her final page, dated February 21st, one day before the fire consumed the infirmary, she records a final conversation with Latoya. "I asked her what she was," she writes. "Not as a nurse, not as a nun, but as a woman." And Latoya responded, "I am the memory your God erased when he feared what you would become." That entry ends with one sentence, shaky, half-scrawled, the ink blurred. She's not here to harm us. She's here to return what was stolen. That journal was suppressed by the diocese until 1978, then sealed again. But now, you know, now you remember, and that changes you forever. After the fire, nothing official remained. No photographs, no death records, no press. The Blessed Mercy Infirmary was struck from state medical archives, labelled unsustainable. The ruins were paved over. But the people? They could not be paved. Because memory, once awakened, doesn't go quietly. The survivors, staff, patients, even locals, began drifting away from Massachusetts. Not all at once, quietly, subtly, like seeds on wind. Dr. Brennan left medicine entirely, moved west, changed his name. But in a small Montana town, local law still tells of a strange old man who could predict births to the hour, who kept a brass locket he never opened, and who would speak in the ocean tongue during thunderstorms. Sister Mary Catherine was never seen again. But 3 convents across the Northeast began reporting anonymous deliveries of hand-copied journals, bound in leather, written in 2 languages. One was English, the other, still undeciphered. And then there were the patients. Those who had been near Latoya the longest. Many lived quiet lives, but their children were different. Born with birthmarks in the shape of spirals, dreaming in ancient words, fearless around water, and they all reported the same thing at different ages, without prompting. "There's a woman in my dreams. She remembers me." One child in Georgia refused to enter a church, not out of rebellion, but from grief. She cried during Mass, saying, "It's not the truth. The real one is under the waves. The church made us forget." What started as memory became movement. They called themselves the Drowned Circle. Small groups scattered across the country. No leaders, no doctrine, just one mission: to remember what was buried. Some believe they were behind the surge of forbidden texts that surfaced online in the early 2000s. Medical notes, scans of Latoya's form, even photos of the Esperanza's manifest. Of course, every time these documents appear, they're deleted, scrubbed, accounts banned, servers wiped. But fragments always survive. Because the circle doesn't work with the internet. It works with remembrance. It passes person to person, voice to voice, dream to dream. And now, to you. Because you've heard too much to walk away clean. You don't unlearn this. You carry it, like salt in the blood, like the weight of water behind your eyes, and you'll start to see it now. in symbols carved on park benches, in names that echo in your sleep, in feelings you can't explain when you stare too long at the ocean. Latoya didn't disappear. She multiplied. They called it Operation Candlelock. A classified initiative, led jointly by state authorities, religious institutions, and unnamed federal agencies, formed after an internal memo reached Washington in 1979. The memo was simple. 2 sentences. She is not folklore. She is active again. The Vatican authorized discreet involvement. The U.S. Department of Health dispatched a private psychiatric assessment team. And the Department of Defense. They sent linguists. What were they trying to contain? A string of unexplainable awakenings. Women across the country, all aged 22 to 28, were reporting ancestral hallucinations. Men were seeing faces in the mirror that weren't theirs. One naval officer went blind during a submarine dive, later claiming he saw an underwater cathedral and a girl wearing chains who unhooked them from his eyes. They all shared one strange trait: blood salinity levels higher than medically possible. They called it oceanic contamination. But they weren't sick. They were changing. And Candlelock's mission was clear: isolate, erase, rewrite. Records were destroyed. Facilities were shut down. Entire families were relocated under genetic anomaly protection orders. In 1982, the Vatican burned 23 boxes of unindexed material from Blessed Mercy. Journals, relics, letters. The flames burned blue. One bishop collapsed during the incineration and was later diagnosed with spiritual compression trauma, a diagnosis that appears nowhere in modern medical literature. But even after that purge, she returned. In the dreams of schoolteachers in Kansas, in the birth cries of daughters named after no one, in the recurring symbols carved into coral off the Florida coast, spirals, crescents, wave eyes. She came back not as a ghost, not as a god, but as a pattern, a rhythm under every empire, a heartbeat beneath every cathedral. Look around. Nothing feels quite the same now, does it? That subtle pull behind your eyes, that pressure in your chest, that ringing in your ears that isn't a sound, but a summon. That's not imagination. That's memory. Your memory. Because this was never about Latoya. Not really. Latoya was the door. She wasn't the storm. She was the key that unlocked it. And the storm is you. The moment you heard her name, the moment you listened to what they tried to burn, you became part of the chain they couldn't break, the pattern they couldn't contain, the inheritance they feared would return. You've always felt it, haven't you? That ache for something older than this world allows. That hunger for power not handed down by title or paycheck or sermon, but born from within. The kind of power that speaks in symbols, in blood, in dreams. The kind they wrote out of history books. But it never left. It hid in the salt of your ancestors' tears. It buried itself in your DNA, waiting for a signal, a story, a frequency that would wake it up. This video was that frequency. You were supposed to scroll. You were supposed to forget. But you didn't. You stayed. You heard. And now, you carry it. That weight, that pressure on your chest, it's not fear. It's return. The return of the you that remembers, the you they tried to civilize, convert, manage, muzzle. The you who was once a keeper of knowledge, a bearer of names older than English, older than scripture, older than empire. This isn't mythology. This is biology. This is resistance encoded in memory. And now you have a choice. Go back. Pretend this was just a story, or step forward. because the ones who hear this are never the same again. If you feel it rising inside you, that strange knowing, that pull toward the forbidden, comment below, "The sea remembers." The sea remembers. Twice. Not for the algorithm, for your transformation. Because once you say it, once you claim it, it's yours again, and they can never take it from you. Not with fire, not with chains, not with lies dressed up as salvation. You were never meant to be small. You were never meant to forget. The tide is rising. You are not alone anymore. Welcome back. End of transmission.